Hi there, and welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahilly, and I will be moderating today's discussion on reimagining operations for what we call the next normal post-COVID-19. We hope you find our conversation useful as you continue to navigate the changing dynamics of this global crisis. And of course, most important, that all of you remain safe and well during these uncertain times. As we begin, just a few words to acknowledge the ongoing human cost of COVID-19 in terms of both lives and livelihoods in regions around the globe. From the start of this pandemic, business leaders have had to reckon first with protecting the safety of their employees and at the same time with what has been a tremendous shock to their operational viability. The crisis has radically changed demand for products and services across every sector, and never has the phrase supply chain vulnerability seemed to be in such common parlance. All of us have been subject either to supply shortages or more often to fears about supply shortages that further affect the way that we shop and live. Now, obviously, as we reach a stage where in many geographies lockdowns are beginning to lift, enabling a safe return to work remains the foremost priority. That is very clear. But what may be surprising as we begin cautiously to look toward a future beyond this crisis is to reflect on how fast some leaders have been able to mobilize a successful response to these pandemic-induced operations challenges. Joining me today are two senior partners, Katie George, leader of our North American operations practice and co-leader of operations globally, and Dan Swan, managing partner of our Stanford office and leader of our manufacturing supply chain work globally. Katie and Dan will talk about what we've learned from the imperative to reconfigure operations over the past few months, and also about how leaders can use these lessons to build operations resilience and reach new levels of performance in future. Katie and Dan, welcome to McKinsey Live. And Katie, over to you to kick us off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to have an opportunity to talk with you today. We're excited to share the work that we're doing with clients across our operations practice, where we serve clients in manufacturing and supply chain and service operations across all industries. And we've been working with our clients to stand operations up in this very unusual time, but also to help our clients think ahead as to how to focus kind of for the next era in terms of what the next normal will look like. If you go to the first page, please, you'll see that these are four areas where most companies now have clear plans and operating models underway. And frankly, I think really from every client I've talked to, every company I've visited or seen, visited virtually, of course, this has all gone so much better than many of my client executives feared it would. I think what we're seeing is real heroics in every part of company organizations that we work with, from frontline employees who have figured out how to keep plants and distribution centers running at least at some minimal level, to companies that have innovated very quickly around creating contactless service delivery, to employees who have really through brute force and a lot of ingenuity connected with customers and suppliers to really get a line of sight on available capacity and on supply and demand, and to ensure that products are going to the customers that need them most, to companies that are finding that they're working better cross-functionally than ever before, making decisions on a day-to-day basis that used to take them months to make. One of our client executives said, we've gotten more done in the last couple of months than we've done in decades. And it really is through just an incredible kind of teamwork across within organizations and across organizations to keep business running. And so that has really been the experience. And now, of course, companies are all working on this ramp-up roadmap in terms of how to think about using social distancing and reconfiguring office space and manufacturing plant floors, et cetera, how to think about using masks and PPE, et cetera, to keep their workforce safe and also allow a return to something that is a bit more normal. But as I said, many of our clients are also now trying to think ahead and thinking about what has to change in the way they operate their operations and what kind of strategies need to change now post-COVID in this next normal. What are some things that used to be on the priority list that are no longer relevant and that they just need to drop? And what possibilities have come about that actually suggest new strategies that would potentially create new capabilities, and how should companies really seek to accelerate those and create some new possibilities from their operations functions. If you go to the next page, these are 5 themes along those lines that we've been talking about with clients and which we'll share with you. We'll go through each of them in turn and just give you a little bit of color commentary on how each of these are playing out across industries. But as you see, these are themes that are both about learning from the COVID-19 experience in terms of building more resilience in supply chains and in increasing capability to manage supply chains more nimbly, as well as other parts of operations, so service operations as well. It's about recognizing the tough economic times that we're in and the uncertainty about exactly what the economic recovery will be. But it's also on this theme number 5, which we'll talk about, reimagining how operations can really play into the overall corporate strategy to create competitive advantage and to create, frankly, new value propositions for customers, whether those are end consumers or whether it's a B2B situation. So with that kind of overview, I'll turn this over to Dan, who's going to take us through the first one around building operations resilience.
Great. Thanks, Katie. As Katie said, one of the key elements that a lot of companies are thinking about now is how to both understand risk and to create a more resilient supply chain. Quite frankly, this is something that a lot of companies were thinking about even prior to COVID, as we were dealing with disruptions, whether that be trade and tariff complications, whether that be events like Brexit or natural disasters that have occurred in the last years. And obviously, this is COVID has been a huge accelerant in terms of bringing this front and center for a lot of companies. We'll call it a couple things in particular. First is this notion of what is your asset strategy, and both think the physical boxes of manufacturing plants, distribution centers, where are they located, and are those places that are in high risk, either geopolitically or from a weather and natural disaster perspective, as well as thinking about where are the places where you want to own the assets and where you want to more have outsourced to create additional flexibility. One of the things that we found very interesting is just making sure that you're looking up into your supply base. The number of conversations I've had over the last 3 to 6 months where clients would feel very comfortable that their suppliers were going to be able to deliver everything. And then when you pushed on it further, real risk that existed within the tier 2 and tier 3 supply base, right? So the thought here is, how do you really think about this as an end-to-end supply chain, reaching all the way back up into your suppliers and their suppliers, all the way out to the customers, to understand where your risk is and what that looks like. And the second one I'm very excited about is this notion for transforming for agility. I think there will come a very natural pressure and tension in the system on where are we willing to invest to create more resiliency. And I honestly believe that there's a lot of places in this agility bucket where there's opportunity for both increased resiliency and improved productivity. Things like creating more common specifications so that products and raw materials can be shared, or components can be shared more easily across products. Things like thinking about the ability to make your products across multiple lines, multiple factories, multiple regions, and then finding ways to increase the optionality for routes to your customers, the route to market. all of these things have the opportunity to both increase resiliency and potentially, depending on your starting point, also create productivity, which will be super important. And the last one in this bucket is probably very obvious, right? Really understanding risk differently. I think the thing for us that we worry a bit about is if you went out today and built the perfect supply chain to deal with COVID, you'd probably not have the right supply chain going forward, right? The key here is really to think about what are the different types of risk that you're exposed to, whether that is geopolitical, whether that is, some sort of human pandemic, whether that is natural disasters, and what is the risk that you're willing to live with, and where are the places where you'd like to add more resiliency into your supply chain, and what's the trade-off and how you think about doing that in an economically responsible way. If you move to the next slide, for each of the 5 areas, each of the 5 areas, we're going to talk a little bit, share one statistic. On this one, 93%, right? 93% of supply chain executives that we polled suggest they're going to be more focused on building a more resilient supply chain going forward. Probably not a surprise given the timing of when that question was asked. You kind of wonder what the other 7% are doing. But for us, the key here is really, as I mentioned, to think about where are the places where the risk really exists, and then what's the best way to build the resiliency into your supply chain, and trying to do that in a systemic and a structural way versus in a reactive way based on the most recent crisis and pandemic.
Dan, interesting question through the feed from the customer perspective. Customers have come to expect supply chains to be super efficient. Do you think customers will be willing to pay more in future to ensure greater resiliency?
Great question. $1 million, well, a lot more than $1 million question. Maybe I'll say a couple things, right? Efficiency still is going to really matter, right? And if we think about especially about the economic environment we're in, where at minimum it's incredibly unstable and potentially, much worse, customers aren't going to want to pay additional ad costs into their product. That being said, I do think there's an opportunity for us to think aggressively about what are those levers that drive both productivity and resiliency into the system. We talked about a few of those earlier, whether that's specifications, flexibility on route to market, flexibility in your manufacturing network, et cetera. And the third thing I would call out is, more and more we are seeing customers, and we'll use that broadly in terms of, whether that's end consumers or in a B2B environment. I do think we're seeing more people thinking about where they buy product and how they buy product with a balanced scorecard mentality, which is obviously cost is front and center to that, but so is quality, so is the service and the reliability you get from that company, so is the speed with which you get that. And so, I do think while they're not going to be eager to pay more for the same product, I do think this notion of how customers will think about in a more balanced perspective will be an interesting thing to watch develop over time.
Great. Maybe we should go on to the second trend, which is around accelerating end-to-end digitization. And this is one, that I think is really a key part of the answer to the question that Dan was just addressing on how do you increase resilience and flexibility, but not increase cost in a commensurate way, because that, I think, will not be acceptable long-term to just add a lot of cost into all of our supply chains in order to improve resilience. And what we found is that end-to-end digitization can make a huge difference. Every large company and many smaller companies have been on some kind of digitization journey, whether it's applying advanced analytics, increasing automation, using digital software solutions. Some of those have been immediately accelerated in kind of the rollout during COVID, like the use of augmented reality. So doing plant inspections virtually, sharing expertise virtually, using digital tools to actually track supply chains to manage near-term changes in demand and supply. But what we're seeing is that many companies have really struggled to create a really great return on investment and a real scale-up plan for these kinds of Industry 4.0 digital and analytics tools. But we've done a host of studies with the World Economic Forum identifying about the 45 or so companies that have been most successful in scaling these technologies. And what I think is most interesting is that these companies have seen 50 to 100% kind of improvements in productivity and therefore cost, which is fantastic. But we also see very significant improvements in agility. And it's really the first time that we see that there's not a trade-off in our operations, whether it's service ops or manufacturing operations. There's no longer necessarily a trade-off between cost and flexibility or cost and agility. And so I think that really scaling up some of these solutions will be a big part of the answer to the questions that are coming up. Just a statistic we'll share with you. If you click 35%, this is of the 45 or so companies that we've identified as some of the most successful scale-up examples of Industry 4.0 technologies. This is a median improvement that they've achieved in reducing lead times and also reducing inventories. So you can see that the improvement in flexibility is quite real. Dan, over to you for the next trend.
Great. And the third one, look, the unfortunate reality is that for many companies, cash is going to be critically important if it's not already in the near term, as people have had to deal with this shock to the system. However, across the board, I think linking back to the first two, there's going to be a need to think about driving both productivity and cash performance. One of the things that we've seen over the last 3 or 6 months is a real difference between companies that were able to have true transparency into their costs and their spend performance, as well as their operating performance. They were able to take decisions more quickly and, quite frankly, take more big decisive action in responding when things were coming along. And so I think it's a real opportunity for all of us to make sure that we've got the transparency around what our cost structure looks like and what the real drivers are. I think this notion of how to think about the next wave of productivity and reassessing your cost structure, becomes critically important in the world of both, unstable economic environment, plus the need to potentially reinvest in your supply chain for more resiliency. And so some companies are thinking about how to really take advantage, to use the word, of a real unique opportunity to rethink and potentially tackle some of the big structural items that have not necessarily been on the table in the past. And finally, from a cash management perspective, both the more operational cash, inventory, AP/AR, plus how we think about our capital spend, can be front and center for folks. The reality is that we see a wide range of capabilities in this space, and having a clear ambition and a rigorous structure and approach to tackling it is critically important. One statistic on this one is 84%. This is just for one sector, in the automotive sector, where the percentage of executives that are taking a hard look at restructuring their cost base. Trying to take a unique opportunity to think differently and think in a big, bold manner about how they drive productivity and performance. Katie, back to you.
Great. The fourth trend is around future of work, which honestly we've all been talking about for the last couple of years. How do companies really upskill their workforce to have the digital and analytics capabilities, not just in some distant center of excellence, but actually in the day-to-day operational teams, whether that's in their production and distribution sites, whether it's in their service delivery teams. And so we've been talking about that for a while. We've also been talking about how do we actually increase the agility of the workforce in terms of how we work. How do we, catch the wave on Agile? As there's lots of hype around it and some really great success stories. I think this is a space that honestly, if I were to think back 6 months ago, was the space that we all knew was important, but was kind of the mushiest in terms of what we actually saw as actions and not as much clarity on kind of what companies should do and how they should do it. This is the space that we see now rapidly changing with COVID because companies are rethinking their physical footprint. They're rethinking the ways teams work together. They realize that virtual teams actually can work very successfully, and that creates all new opportunities for changing the kind of governance structures and the rhythms of planning teams and others. And we're seeing a real wake-up call around upskilling the workforce with digital and analytics. In fact, if you see the statistics we're going to show you is 9 out of 10 supply chain leaders are now saying that they are embedding digital and analytics skills into the job requirements and the job postings for their supply chain talent. And really making that a critical part of development pathways as well. That sounds, again, obvious, but that's not what we saw 6 months ago. We saw 6 months ago real variability in whether analytics was considered a core requirement for these roles or whether it was something that was a nice to have where the analytics could be brought to bear by specialists who are hired. So I think we're seeing a real step up here on the future of work.
Katie, quick question from the feed. Obviously, manufacturing is a hot topic in the future of work discussion. When you look specifically at the manufacturing context, do you see this crisis as having shifted the balance between human and automated workforces and accelerated the shift toward that kind of automation?
Yes, I think we will see that. We haven't, many of my clients are talking about how to accelerate some of the automation, but also things like augmented reality, as I mentioned before, because they want to be less dependent, and they have to, in the very near term, be less dependent on having kind of full workforce back working closely together as they used to. The one thing I will say, though, is, again, referencing the work we've done with World Economic Forum, which you can see on our website, is that what's been actually a very positive part of that research, from my view, is that the companies that we have looked at, and they're all manufacturing sites. That was our initial focus. We've now started to look at end-to-end supply chains. But if you look at the manufacturing sites specifically, since that was the context of your question, the Industry 4.0 adoption has had what I would describe a very worker-centric approach. This has not been about replacing the entire workforce with automation. It's about augmenting the workforce with new capabilities that, frankly, are increasing workforce engagement and workforce satisfaction in these companies, and really retraining the workforce such that they are actively engaged in developing apps and leveraging new technologies to make their jobs easier and to get rid of some of the pain points from the work that they were doing previously, whether it is automating some of the most difficult tasks that are tedious and also difficult, or whether it's actually having apps that allow them to reduce the amount of errors and therefore the rework, et cetera. So it's actually been a very, very positive story with democratization of data and technology, a lot of investment in workforce upskilling, and then quite an exciting story around workforce engagement. Maybe we should close out with a last trend, which I'll hand back over to Dan.
Great. So what will it take to win in this new environment? You know, obviously no one has a crystal ball. And obviously that's going to change quite drastically based on your individual situation, by industry, by geography, and your specific company context. I think there's a few things that we would call out that we think are really interesting, right? One is innovation and the role that will play in helping companies even differentiate even more going forward. And importantly, what is the role that supply chain and operations can play in that? For all the supply chain folks that have been asked about cost over and over again, the opportunity to really drive innovation and new business models is, I think exciting and, could be a real breakthrough going forward. The second is we usually see an uptick in M&A on the backside of some, economic events. Who will have the cash and created the cash, be prepared to make the right move and, the skills to deliver and execute upon it. And the reality is that sustainability and climate was the number one priority for many executives coming out of Davos this year, right? It's taken a bit of a break, given COVID, but we expect this to come roaring back and be a real source of differentiation for companies, both in terms of their workforce and in terms of their broadest set of stakeholders going forward. Certainly not all these things will be important to everyone. One of the things that we have seen coming out of the last economic downturn in 2009 was those companies that acted decisively and took action early on, a couple things that were going to be differentiators for them, really outperformed over the subsequent few years. So view this as a call to action to figure out what are the 2 or 3 things that are going to matter the most for you in the new normal and start moving on them sooner than later. The statistic for this one is a fun one for a supply chain person, 10 to 20%, right? This is just an example of a few companies that have created 10 to 20% top line growth from new business models such as mass customization, et cetera. And like I said, this is, I think, a unique point in time for supply chain and operations to really make a difference, not just on the bottom line of the business, but in really moving the needle on a top line and a growth perspective.
Great. We're almost at time, but I do want to try to get in one question because scores of participants have asked some version of this question, which is that the possible regionalization of supply chains has been driving headlines for the past few months. Do you really expect to see a significant shift to bring supply chains closer to the customer?
Let me answer quickly first, and then Dan, you may want to build on this. But actually, regionalization of supply chains had been happening way before COVID. So if you look at our McKinsey Global Institute report on the I think it's called the New Globalization, you'll see that actually global physical trade as a percent of GDP has peaked, and we're on our way down. And so we see increasingly that supply chains have been organized regionally versus cross-continentally. That's not universal, of course. It depends by segment. And so I do think, yes, that we will see increased regionalization of our supply chains because it was already happening, in part because of the dramatic increase in demand, customer demand in China and in Asia. So there's more Asian production for Asia. But I also think that this COVID crisis has really put a spotlight on the need to diversify geographically across companies' footprints. There's, of course, been an increase in what you could describe as nationalist kind of focus around wanting critical supply chains in country. And I think that will make a difference and accelerate that. I don't know, Dan, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the same or something different?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Katie. I think it is very sector dependent. I mean, the two things I would call out is it's really important when you think about moving manufacturing plants and stuff that, again, people think about their supply chain end to end. Because if your supply base is still based in China, but your manufacturing plants are somewhere else, or vice versa, really got to think about that holistically. And I think something that Katie said is really important is the notion of degrees of freedom, right? Because one of the ways that you actually create more resiliency is by having options for how products get to your customers. Some of the risk can be taken out with more regionalization. Others it's more difficult. And so, the real key here is, in addition to what we will continue to see on regionalization, how we manage to create more flexibility within our supply chains.
Fantastic. Katie and Dan, what a great discussion. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. On behalf of McKinsey Live, we thank all of you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to your feedback in the very super quick 10-second survey that'll appear when you close your event console. Also, in a few days, we will post a recording of today's session on our COVID Response Center on McKinsey.com. You can also visit the COVID Response Center for details on upcoming sessions, including Reimagining Organizations for Post-Pandemic Times, which is next week, Thursday, June 25th. We look forward to having you join us next week for McKinsey Live. See you there, and have a great day or evening.